He called himself a stranger to his own people, but now he's considered up there with Chopin in the pantheon of Polish composers. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're talking about Karol Szymanowski. Karol Szymanowski was born in an upper-middle-class Polish family in October 1882, on land that was at that point a part of the Russian Empire and is now in modern-day central Ukraine. He was the second of an eventual 5 children and was taught music starting at age 7 by his father, who was a cellist and pianist, who sought to give all of his children as rich a cultural life as possible. His mother and uncle were both pianists as well, and Karol and his siblings would often give concerts at home. At one point, he wrote a small opera which was performed in-house. He went off to the Warsaw Conservatory in 1901, and while he was not a full-time student there, he did study composition, counterpoint, piano, and instrumentation. His time in Warsaw, the cultural capital of a then still partitioned Poland, introduced him to innovations in other arts, such as the mystical poetry of Tadeusz Mickiewicz. Mickiewicz was a part of the Young Poland movement in literature and the visual arts, and it wasn't long until the efforts of the young Szymanowski and his contemporaries were branded the musical equivalent of this movement. Szymanowski always felt a draw to his homeland, well, at the very least his home people, and did his best to promote Polish music outside Poland. To that end, he actually ran a publishing firm in Berlin for the first 6 or so years of the 20th century that was dedicated exclusively to publishing the works of Polish composers. Underwritten by Prince Władysław Lubomirski, this young group had attempted to promote Polish music through putting on concerts and selling sheet music. Szymanowski's opportunities in the Russian Empire were significantly limited. He had come to Warsaw in the same year that the Warsaw Philharmonic was founded, but he became frustrated by Poland's deep-seated musical conservatism. While he and his compatriots admired the styles of Wagner and Strauss and struggled, as so many young composers did, to find their own unique voice in this lush late Romanticism, the Polish press could be vicious in attacking them for not being nationalistic enough, for not being patriotic. The only reason that Szymanowski ended up in Warsaw in the first place is because his father was deeply skeptical of the Russians, and he didn't want his son going off to study at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, which was a little more open-minded and would have suited him better. Warsaw was just culturally isolated, and so as soon as he could, he traveled around to wherever he could. Largely, he found a home in German-speaking lands, and so between his graduation and the outbreak of World War I, he spent most of his time in his home base in Berlin or Vienna. He very much absorbed the culture and music of his time and place, and as a result, his pieces up through about 1914 are written very much in the Germanic tradition. Szymanowski's mastery of counterpoint, as we will later see, can be traced back to these origins. His Second Symphony from 1909 was Szymanowski's first major success as a composer. But the critics were ultimately right. He would not stay a Wagnerian for very long. Composer and conductor Grzegorz Fittelberg helped get Szymanowski a publishing deal with Universal Edition in 1912. A chronic knee problem, an injury he sustained when he was 4 years old, kept him out of service in World War I. He spent his time absorbing and expanding his fields of knowledge beyond music, to include ancient Greek history and philosophy, to the culture of the Middle East, which he'd been to while on tour. Now he was actually engaging with that culture and putting those influences into his music, as he was confined to his hometown of Tymashovka during the war. This so-called second period, if you will, of Szymanowski's career is what really begins to separate him from many of his contemporaries. No longer bound by either Germanic late Romanticism or the aspiring modernism of his Polish compatriots, he began to explore these other themes in his work, beginning with the love songs of Hafiz, which sets poems by the 14th century Persian poet named Hafiz. This is regarded by Szymanowski scholars as a transitionary work because it is still in German, and the poetry that was translated and ultimately set invokes themes of earthly pleasures and a certain longing for death as the ultimate transcendent goal, which is super romantic. It makes sense then that the paraphraser and translator of this song cycle, Hans Bethge, also worked on the Tang Dynasty poems that eventually became Gustav Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde. Certain movements of this song cycle look forward to his more progressive moments, an emphasis on color and texture and orchestration, and even hints of polytonality. Mysticism was also a key factor here, and he didn't just find it in 700-year-old Persian poetry. Critics have noted his music's similarity, especially in this period, to that of Alexander Scriabin, especially when writing for the orchestra, in his use of large orchestras, solo instruments, and choir, which has wordless passages in his Third Symphony, which he finished in 1916. Importantly, it should be noted that Szymanowski's interest in Middle Eastern culture did not extend to interest in Middle Eastern music theory. There's no evidence that he ever learned any Arabic music theory whatsoever. Szymanowski was aware that his music was going in a new direction. He'd met Igor Stravinsky in Paris in 1914 and wrote that he was, because of Stravinsky's genius, beginning to hate the Germans. In reference to three major violin works written during the war, the Nocturne and Tarantella, the Myths, and the First Violin Concerto, Szymanowski said that he had hit upon a new mode of expression for the instrument. These three pieces were all written between 1915 and 1916 in collaboration with violinist Paweł Kochanski, a brilliant Polish violinist who was concertmaster of the Warsaw Philharmonic when he was 14 years old, which is when Szymanowski had met him. Kochanski had just been appointed to the faculty at the St. Petersburg Conservatory, and it's his collaborative and creative abilities that gives these pieces the shine that they have. The two also were very fast workers. Szymanowski wrote his First Violin Concerto in something like 12 days in August 1916. There's actually very little new in the way of techniques when it comes to these Szymanowski-Kochanski collaborations, except in the use of some of the first notated quarter-tone accidentals in music history, and some unusual double stops in succession in the Opus 30 Myths. But it was more about the way in which virtuosity was used. He didn't dispense with it. Rather, he integrated it into his style. Virtuosity was now a timbral and a coloristic device, not just fireworks to please an audience. The 19th century's bank of techniques became the 20th century's starting point for fresh sonorities. Bela Bartok was a big fan of myths and often performed it with various Hungarian violinists. Kochanski's playing also prefigured later violinists' styles of playing because he employed a nearly continuous vibrato, theretofore not the standard way of playing the instrument. And he varied the vibrato based on where in the piece he was and what kind of expressiveness it called for. The myths in particular combine French-inspired sonorities with Germanic counterpoint and a harmonic language that includes Scriabin's famous mystic chord. I should point out that even though we can draw similarities between second period Szymanowski and Scriabin, the differences between the two are still quite striking. And Szymanowski said that he didn't feel significantly indebted to Scriabin, only insofar as they were both big fans of Chopin. Szymanowski knew where the cultural winds were blowing and noted that before the war there was a growing and awakening interest in musical modernism in both France and Russia, which would later end up combining forces and after the war contribute to the downfall of the kind of iron grip that Germanic music had over the continent. In the wake of an ideological crisis, of which World War I was merely a physical manifestation, a new order would have to rise from the ashes. Reconstructing art and culture from a very basic level would, in Szymanowski's mind, inevitably follow. It was this rejection of the Germanic tradition that he held to be the inception of the modernism that was brewing in France and Russia. And so his rejection of Germanic influences seems to have been a very conscious thing for him, a conscious evolution of his style, that he was casting away the old and embracing the new. So even though a new mode of expression is perhaps a little bit of an overstatement, it is true that we can credit Szymanowski's violin writing, in collaboration with Kochanski of course, as the starting point of a whole set of fresh 20th century sounds. He very much reset the field for the mode of expression that would come to dominate the genre for the rest of the century. His first concerto is a rejection of the Romantic tendency to turn the concerto into a battle, an epic struggle between soloist and orchestra. Instead, they work together. This was carried forward especially in the first violin concerto of Sergei Prokofiev, which was also written in collaboration with Kochanski, although many other composers sought his advice as well, including Stravinsky. While unproven, it's likely that a poem by his friend Myshinsky inspired the structure of the first violin concerto, and basing a piece off of a poem that's not a part of the piece at all, it's just instrumental, is also very much a Scriabin thing to do. Some have argued that Szymanowski's middle period of composition, with its distancing itself from tonality, embrace of modernism, and its embrace of certain exoticism, if you will, is reminiscent of what the Impressionist composers were doing in France. But Szymanowski's style and his relationship to non-Western influences is a very personal thing. Like, he did some of the same things as Debussy, but certainly not to the same degree. If you really wanted to, I guess you could say there are elements of Impressionism mixed in with late Romanticism, but frankly, I don't like this because we're trying to, put composers into boxes and label things evenly, when really there's not a good way to organize them. Szymanowski would have agreed with me there. Much as Debussy and Ravel didn't like being called Impressionist, he also objected to them being called Impressionists, saying that it was just a superficial analogy to painting. Nonetheless, he noted that an understanding of what made French music would only help Polish composers in their quest to make truly Polish music. And Szymanowski did borrow techniques of tonal ambivalence from the French. Your non-functional chords, your planing and parallel motion, your whole tone scales, but that doesn't make it French. That doesn't even make it Impressionist, really. There's also the use of what some Szymanowski scholars have called keyboard bitonality, which pits the white key diatonic collection against the black key pentatonic collection. You can do this arbitrarily just by transposing it up and down, but it's called keyboard bitonality because it's the collections you can really see on the keyboard, white keys versus black keys. Overall, you could say that Szymanowski was about as much of an Impressionist as was Scriabin, who was also influenced by the French and their techniques, but also in a highly individual direction. Like Scriabin, Szymanowski embraced complex harmonies, didn't feel rushed to resolve his dissonances, and in his middle period was just as influenced by a kind of vague, languorous mysticism. In these respects, it's only Szymanowski and the short-lived English composer William Baines who were able to embrace this kind of mysticism and languor in their music, which is clearly an homage to Scriabin's style without just ripping the Russian off. For Szymanowski, the influence of the French and Russian styles was less of a tradition to convert to and more of a way to get out from under the strict and abiding presence of the Germanic style. He didn't believe that art needed to be political or national, instead speaking to something grander about the nature of the human condition. This is why he was so drawn to Greek mythology and the poetry and the philosophy of the ancient times, as well as more contemporary philosophers such as Friedrich Nietzsche. Szymanowski didn't care for comparisons to other composers, and especially detested the music of Arnold Schoenberg. Comparing him to Schoenberg was just asking for trouble. Szymanowski worked in the expanded tonal architecture of the late Romantic and didn't feel any pressing need, as Schoenberg did, to completely revolutionize Western music. But for Szymanowski, tonality made an impact in the short term, not the long term. In other words, he doesn't give you the harmonic returns that had long characterized form. He'll give you the same motives and he'll recapitulate his material and he'll keep developing things you've heard before, but they're not going to come back in the key that they started in. Expressiveness in many of his greatest pieces is a result of a conflict between consonance and dissonance, sometimes an ambiguity as to which is consonance and which is dissonance. But nevertheless, he was working with stress and tension and resolution and consonance and dissonance, the very things that were the building blocks of both common practice tonality and his own extended tonality. So it makes sense that he would not like the music and musical philosophy of any composer or theorist who was trying to upend that system, as Schoenberg was trying to do. While World War I may not have affected him, the Russian Revolution sure did. In October 1917, the Szymanowski family home was destroyed, completely ransacked, and Szymanowski's childhood compositions were all lost to time. Szymanowski landed in a family townhouse in Elisabethgrad, where he stayed until January 1918, when the town was occupied by the Bolsheviks. He would never own another house for the rest of his life, instead having to rent his places in which he stayed. Even though he returned to Warsaw in 1919, now the capital of a once again unified Poland, he would never again own his own piano. Between 1918 and 1920, he wrote no music. It didn't help that his longtime collaborator Kochanski had immigrated to the United States full-time in 1921, leaving him without a trusted friend and collaborator. He felt as though a stranger in his homeland, in this cultural vacuum, which was inescapable. He thought back to his travels in the Mediterranean, specifically Italy and North Africa, which he'd taken between 1909 and 1914. His three-act opera King Roger, about a 12th century Sicilian king named, well, Roger, was conceived in Odessa when he was vacationing with his cousin Yarosław Iwaskiewicz. Szymanowski's sister, Stanisława Korwin-Szymanowska, was the lead soprano. Good to see he was keeping it in the family. What is that, too Sicilian? If Italy didn't exist, Szymanowski had written in 1910, then I could not exist either. So drawn was he to its culture and its people. Anyway, Szymanowski found it necessary to tour a whole lot more in order to pay the bills, and nowhere in the world was hungrier for new music, especially in the wake of a world war, than the United States of America. The first of two extended American tours had commenced in 1920 alongside Paweł Kochanski and Otto Rubinstein, old friends who, along with Fittelberg, had before the war made a habit of late drinking and hard partying that left them footing the bill for hotel repairs. And people think rock stars have invented this concept of trashing hotel rooms. In 1926, he got two job offers, head of the conservatories in Warsaw and in Cairo. And despite much personal indecision, he eventually decided to accept the job at his own home turf, now officially the Warsaw Conservatory, but he failed to keep this post long term. He was diagnosed with tuberculosis and sought medical treatment when and where he could, although he stayed on at the conservatory trying to do his job until 1929, when conservative factions within the conservatory finally forced him out. He was back at it again in 1930 as the head of the Warsaw Academy of Music, but that shut its doors in 1932. He then moved south to one of Poland's southernmost towns, Zakopane, on the Czechoslovakian border, which he had visited frequently starting in 1922, and it was here where he threw himself into composition as much as he could before the tuberculosis would eventually kill him. This final period of composition saw him embrace a nationalistic Polish idiom, specifically trying to emulate the music of the Goral people, who lived in the Polish highlands in that part of the country. This outward embrace of Polish nationalism obviously is indebted largely to the works of Frédéric Chopin. And in the Chopinist tradition, Szymanowski was quite fond of the traditional folk dance known as the Mazurka, which is a fast kind of dance in triple time, where the stress falls anywhere but beat one, really. But the harmonic language of Szymanowski's piano mazurkas is deeply complicated and is the result of the combination of everything he learned to do over the course of his career. One gets the sense that his mazurkas are tonal, but trying to figure out which notes are consonant and which ones are dissonant is practically a minefield. Open fifths and harmonic clarity in, say, Chopin become wrong note harmonies and bitonal clashes between different hands or different parts of a texture in Szymanowski's mazurkas. And while yes, sometimes you'd get exotic sounding moments in Chopin's pieces, Szymanowski was very fond of something called the Podalian mode. This is a name for a kind of mode which has many names: Lydian flat 7, Mixolydian sharp 4, the acoustic scale, whatever. It's this scale. This works well alongside whole tone scales because you'll notice that from, well, in this example, from B flat to F sharp, it's nothing but whole tones. Now impoverished, Szymanowski was stuck between his dire finances and his ill health. His smoking and drinking certainly didn't help, and he toured as much as he could, including a tour of Scandinavia in 1935, but it just wasn't enough. His last major composition, the Second Violin Concerto from 1933, was the last piece premiered by his old friend Kochanski before he himself died of cancer. Szymanowski had lived beyond his means for many years and had racked up debts all over Europe. He knew that he had very little to no knowledge of how to live practically and within his means, writing to his sister Stanisława in 1934 that each day he had to go see his friends to borrow a few złoty, the Polish currency, to get by. He would leave Zakopane for treatments elsewhere, but it was not enough. Tuberculosis was incurable, and he died from it in March 1937 at the age of only 54, in a French-speaking part of Switzerland where his sister Stanisława was at the time living. His heart was sent to the Holy Cross Church in Warsaw to be interred next to the heart of Chopin, but it was destroyed in the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. While his long interest in Polish music did not fully emerge until the last decade of his life, he was fascinated by the music of his homeland throughout his entire career. This includes, of course, the many fine examples of Polish dances as elevated to high art by Frédéric Chopin, who, despite Szymanowski's best efforts, remains the world's best-known Polish composer. The particular exotic-sounding aspects of chorale music is what drew Szymanowski in. Heterophony, that is, a kind of technique where the same thing is basically stated in two or more different ways, but slightly different, but superimposed on one another, is a common feature in chorale music, but is a distinct omission from much of the rest of the West. Chorale music can also be very spicy in its dissonances, something any self-respecting 20th century composer should love. Szymanowski was also a lyrical and melodic composer, and most folk music has an emphasis on this lyricism and melody as opposed to, harmony. And what harmony exists in chorale folk music is often open fifths and minor seconds. Szymanowski's music is not atonal, at least not on the surface level, but the more in the background you get, the more analysts are scratching their heads. There's not this long-term tonal architecture that you would expect, even though the moment-to-moment experience of listening to a piece, it sounds like it's in this late Romantic tradition. In terms of playing around with keys, Szymanowski was quite fond of using polytonality, which was by no means a new invention. I mean, not with him or any of his contemporaries. You go back to, it was used for comedic effect in even Mozart. But he used it in a very unique way, and often for long periods of time. Look no further than the third and final movement of his Opus 37 string quartet from 1917, the first of two such quartets he would come to write, which has one of the strangest imitative passages. But after just a little while, the four keys sound almost, dare I say, kinda normal? Much of this has to do with the relationships between key signatures here. The tonal centers of each of these instruments build a diminished seventh. So if each instrument plays diatonically, which happens more often than not, each instrument will have 4 notes in common with the instruments around it, and 2, due to enharmonic equivalencies, between the instruments that are 2 away, which would be the cello second violin pair and the viola first violin pair. By paying attention to the relationships between key areas, Szymanowski creates a sustained polytonal structure, which sounds unusual, definitely, but it doesn't exactly sound like you'd expect 4 keys at one time to sound. I would say this because they're all playing diatonically, and they're all evenly spaced around the chromatic space. Szymanowski was a fantastic orchestrator, which meant that he knew as much about acoustics as he did about the instruments of the orchestra and how they balanced and fit together as a cohesive unit. He was capable of handling the largest orchestras with the utmost dexterity, and was especially good at integrating unusual instruments into his textures very well. Instruments like the organ and the piano, which I get, they are not uncommon instruments, but in terms of a standard orchestral layout they are, and they have a tendency to pop out of the texture. And he was really good at being able to integrate them and make them sound like they were part of a larger orchestral body as opposed to a featured soloist or something like that. He disagreed with Stravinsky on the nature of the piano. Stravinsky believed that the piano was essentially just a glorified percussion instrument, and while it is technically true, Szymanowski loved it for its lyrical capabilities. He was also very specific on the number of string players that he would have in one of his orchestras. A lot of composers will say a minimum or a maximum, but no, he knew the number of string players he needed down to the number of stands. Unusually, Szymanowski was also fairly openly gay in a time when this was very much looked down upon, especially by Catholic officials in a very conservative Poland. He read a 2-volume novel on the subject called Ephebos in 1918, which shows his creativity, his productivity, his willingness to work outside of just music, and again, his boldness in being open and willing to talk about something that most would still be in the closet about. He felt that it was worthy of publication, but did not want it to be published so long as his mother was still alive. This work was lost in 1939 during the Warsaw Siege, and only one chapter, which was translated into Russian, survives. His friends knew him as a warm and funny character, but he was slow to warm up with strangers and suffered from agoraphobia. Arthur Rubinstein recalled his reticence to show his music to anyone who hadn't already heard of him. When it comes to self-promotion, come on. Composers have to be good at self-promoting. It's the only way we're going to be able to survive in this world. Szymanowski has enjoyed decent popularity since his death, although obviously we were deprived of what he would have done had he lived into the 1940s and 1950s. Part of why he's not programmed more is because his music is really complicated on several levels. Conductors have noted that his symphonies take more time to put together than most, and his unusual approach to form means that you have to be really good at interpreting these pieces and communicating them to the listener, otherwise they're going to sound flat and unfinished. His second symphony, for instance, has only 2 movements, which is unusual in its own right, but each of these movements have these subtle connections between them, and bringing out these subtle connections is the conductor's job. It takes a lot more time to do that, even though the piece isn't the longest piece in the repertoire. Some is just a logistical challenge. The third symphony requires a tenor soloist, a choir, and an organ, all for just 30 minutes worth of music. The logistical problem here is that you need to hire all these extra performers on top of your standard symphony orchestra, and you're left with 30 minutes of music. You can't anchor a program with that, so you have to find other pieces which use the same forces, ideally, to round out the program, and most of those pieces are going to be huge concert-spanning works. Not to be outdone, his fourth symphony from 1932 is subtitled Symphonie Concertate, and is stylistically a cross between a symphony and a piano concerto. His first violin concerto remained for the rest of his life his favorite work, and he readily admitted that it was a symphonic work that merely gave the impression of being a concerto, which upon further analysis seems to be some kind of fantasy rondo form. The violin exploits its ability to fade into and out of the rest of the orchestra, which gives the piece a more sprawling feel than its runtime would indicate. And do you remember that polytonal stuff from his first string quartet? That goes along eventually until there's a quiet plucked cadence in C major, and then that's it. That's the end of the movement and the end of the piece. The third and final movement of this quartet is like the third and penultimate movement of a more standard quartet, where a scherzo-like movement usually functions as an inner movement prior to a more weighty finale. This lopsidedness was perhaps initially the result of the upheaval from the Russian Revolution, but he just never got around to writing a fourth movement, even though he had the time to do so if he had so chosen. What this means is that this is a lopsided quartet, and the performers have to try to make the piece sound as finished as possible, even though it seems like it's missing an entire movement. But it also means that listeners have to meet the performers and meet Szymanowski pretty much halfway with their own expectations. Throw on top of it all of his harmonic tricks and his contrapuntal wizardry, and you get a music that one critic described as, quote, too original to be described in print, unquote. This is the very thing that makes Szymanowski an interesting and unique composer, and what makes his music worthwhile and rewarding to explore.